You know the advice. Use the best watercolor paper you can. But how do we know what's the best? Well, the best is generally associated with the phrase 100% cotton, but it's also typically associated with buco bucks. So how do we choose the best paper when our budget is limited? How do we even afford to try them when the options seem almost limitless?
Today I am testing 15 100% cotton paper outliers and spilling the tea on which are the best, the most reliable, and which will deliver the most bang for your buck. There is a caveat though. I'm purposely omitting the luxury options, as I like to call them. Arches, St. Cuthbert's, Fabriano, as I believe these brands are in a class by themselves. But it's important to understand why before we move forward. Because a lot of papers claim that 100% cotton label, but there's a lot more that's behind the label that gives you an idea of the paper's true quality. So let's understand that the pinnacle of 100% cotton paper is the following. It's a mold-made paper, which means that the fibers, the cotton fibers, are more evenly distributed. It's internally and externally sized. So it's sized all the way through, gives the painter a lot more control among many other things. And those cotton fibers are longer fibers. They're not cotton pulp. So each of the papers I'm reviewing today does knowingly deviate from the gold standard I just described in one or more ways. But they're still more affordable and there's gold to be found here. Let's figure it out. First up, some vocabulary. Cotton. We've got cotton rag and cotton linters. Cotton rag, not to be confused with rag paper. And it just means longer fibers, basically your better quality. Cotton linters are shorter fibers. Sizing. This has nothing to do with the size of the paper. We've got two types of sizing, external and internal. You'll sometimes hear brands refer to sizing all the way through the paper. And from my understanding, that just means they have externally and internally sized the paper. And that seems to be the best way, and it gives the artist the most consistent result with the finished paper that they're using for their work. Now, how it's made. Machine made, and this is going to be most commercial papers. Mold made, this is a cylinder mold, and this is the Golden Crew. This is your Arches, Hahnemühle, etc. And then handmade. It's still mold made, but not a cylinder mold. With the reviews coming up in this video, you're going to hear me talking a lot about quote unquote weird stuff happening. And most often, the weird stuff that is happening is some combination of the cotton content or type of cotton, and more importantly, the sizing material and sizing method and consistency. But it could also just be a paper exposed to unnecessary chemicals or additives during the production process. And most importantly, I need you to remember that the label 100% cotton is no guarantee that you're about to invest in the best paper for your money. Today, I'm testing GenCrafts, Academy, Tumatra, Zen Art, Paul Reubens, Graby, Artbeak, New York Central, Artist Loft, Cody, Fluid, Arteza, Meeden, Art & Fly, and Art Whale.
I reached out to every single one of the brands that I reviewed here today. Only 4 got back to us. And even then, some of the information was a little vague. So the rest of the information that we gathered was from other reviewers, which were not very plentiful, or website information. And I also did a little bit with artificial intelligence. I used ChatGPT to go out and find some information that it could, but of course, taking that with a grain of salt. And all of this really confirms my belief that not all 100% cotton papers are created equal. And of course, all of the testing reveals that as well. You'll come to find out soon. So now going in, I did my absolute best to make sure that I could provide you with information about the vegan status of the papers and how they were sized, how they were made. But ultimately, this information is tentative.
And I'll be judging each by the following standards: the texture and the thickness, the consistency, is there even sizing, the strength, does it pill easily, the versatility, will it handle mixed media, and of course, the price. I'm dedicating 2 4x6 sheets for the testing overall. The first sheet, I'm painting a flower, a strawberry, and a little bit of a washy background. And on this sheet, I'll be using all different types of mediums
and really pushing the envelope for what these papers can do.
And that second sheet is really looking at the sizing quality and how much of a beating the paper can take. That's right. I believe when we're testing papers, we really should kind of push them beyond their limits or abuse them, because that will really give beginners an idea.
If a paper can take abuse,
then I know that paper is essentially frustration-free and is not going to cause any roadblocks.
First up, we have Gen Crafts.
I noticed right away that the sizing in the paper seemed consistent when applying washes of color. There was some questionable areas where the paint seemed to resist just slightly, but nothing too concerning. I didn't notice any pilling on the first page with the flower and the strawberry. The washes seemed effortless. Even with mixed media, I used that watercolor marker, which is an ink-based, and I was still able to move the color around effortlessly. My second test with all the washes, I did notice after the blue wash was dry, there was some strange dots along the left-hand side of that stroke. That cautions me to inconsistent sizing. I tried so hard to make this paper pill, but it really didn't budge. It did seem like the fibers were lifting slightly as I was applying all that scrubbing pressure. Now, you might have noticed the texture of Gen Crafts is definitely not a traditional cold press texture. It's more of like a grid.
But if this is something that doesn't bother you, this paper could be a winner.
Next up, we have Academy, and I'll tell you what, in terms of the first page of tests with the flower and the strawberry, everything felt reliable. That's the best word I can think to describe this. It has a very classic texture, slightly less obvious than Arches, but so close. It has definitely the slowest drying time overall. That's a little like prelude to what's coming, friends. I definitely noticed that it took the longest for it to dry, and that is a good thing, remember. I found it took the watercolor pencil beautifully, meaning that it blended away and smoothed out really easily. So it didn't like grab the pigment and hold onto it right away. It let me kind of work with it. Those inky watercolor marker washes over on the right-hand side, just exactly like what I would expect. Everything kept moving on the paper. I was able to blend and wash things out. No issues with sizing. I didn't get any weird like resist moments. And that's what you're going to notice with a paper that has inconsistent sizing. Strathmore is a classic example of a paper that's got inconsistent sizing in my experience. And what you'll notice is there will be areas where the paint literally won't take. It'll feel like there's wax or oil or something on the paper. Looking at the second page, after it's dry, beautiful washes, very resistant to unexpected cauliflowering or blooming that a lot of folks don't really care for. I couldn't get this to pill if I had tried for another hour. I don't think this paper feels like it's like watercolor paper armor. Also worth noting here, it feels like it's as thick as it should be for a 140-pound paper. That's something I noticed as I went through the different brands. A lot of them say they're 140-pound, but a lot of them feel lighter, and that to me is off-putting. Moving on to Tumatra. In general, I was pretty pleased with this paper. It's a little bit thinner, doesn't feel like a true 140-pound. And it's smoother in texture. It's certainly not hot press, but definitely smoother than a traditional cold press. I noticed when I tried to use the watercolor pencil, there was a slight pilling. It was very easy for the fibers of the paper to kind of be disturbed by the pressure of that pencil. It felt really good with general washes, and it dried pretty slowly when I went in to add those linear details into the leaves. My second sheet of testing felt pretty similar to Academy when everything was wet on the page. I was able to really beat up the paper, scrub without any pilling. The initial blue wash looked really good. Now, when things started to dry, I definitely noticed when I looked closer into the blue wash, there was definitely some odd textures that didn't make sense in terms of how the wash looked when it was wet. And so that tells me there may be some sizing issues here. Next up, we've got Zen Art. The texture of this paper is definitely smoother. Out of all of them, it is the closest to a hot press,
which is disappointing for a paper that is advertised as cold press.
Worked well with some of the mixed media, the inky watercolor marker. At first, the blending of the watercolor pencil was fantastic, but it very quickly started to lift up the fibers pretty significantly. And when it was dry,
that was even more noticeable.
But also kind of makes sense given the more smooth texture. It's not going to take a beating as easily as
a more traditional watercolor paper.
Again, because this paper is smoother, the second test went as I thought it would. The washes weren't as effortlessly even as I expected them to be. And also, it wouldn't take a beating like some of the other papers. It pilled
as I started to apply any kind of pressure.
Now, this paper could be a really interesting option if you were working with colored pencils, perhaps, or even exclusively watercolor pencils where you
want a smoother finish.
Next up, we have Paul Reubens. And a lot of you have given me the feedback already that it is such a nice brand to work with for watercolor paper. All right, here's where I'm at. Classic texture, which is a bonus in my book. In terms of the texture, it's a bit smaller, so that's where it differs. So the little pebbly texture that is all over the surface of the paper is just scaled down, if that makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know in comments. No pilling at all,
which is what I would expect.
It feels like a good 140-pound paper, so it stays wet. I did find it more difficult to blend the watercolor pencil, but ding, 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 you guessed it. Any more textured paper for watercolor is going to give you a run for your money when it comes to blending and watercolor pencils.
I'm always hoping though that I find a good cold press watercolor paper that works for colored pencils. Maybe we will.
On my second page of testing though, I noticed that this paper warps dramatically. I've never noticed it before because I always use the blocks where they are glued on 3 of 4 sides. But when I had this bad boy loose, oh my gosh, I felt like it was just gonna spring. And I also noticed it just started to show a little bit of distress or pilling when I really pushed it further than I did in the first test. Now, I haven't forgotten that I am judging these also based on price because I know that's an important factor. And we're gonna be getting to that towards the end of the video where I'm gonna stack all of these up next to one another. We are going to get
down to the nitty-gritty of cost.
Moving on to Graby. At the time of recording this, I feel like this is a newer brand, or at least newer to me. The marketing, packaging is gorgeous, fun patterns.
So it's important to make sure it lives up to all the pretty marketing hype.
This is another smoother texture paper, but it does feel like a classic 140-pound weight, which is a good thing. I won't say that it is a smooth watercolor or a hot press. I first noticed it getting a little weird with wet on wet when I was working on that big leaf next to the peach flower. So that was a little concerning. The paint just didn't seem to want to move when I used a similar amount of water that I'd been using. When I started painting the strawberry, I continued to notice the weird washing effects. The paint just didn't seem to flow like I'd want it to. I felt like I had to manipulate things with my brush. A really good watercolor paper is going to give you smooth washes effortlessly. As long as you have a decent handle on water control, you're going to get beautiful washes easily. And so that's why this is a parameter I'm using. The watercolor marker wash was okay, no issues with that. This dries fast. On the second page of tests, this is where things really started to crumble. Definitely seeing pilling, definitely seeing little weird dots when the page is dry, suggesting that there's some issues. So Graby, I don't know. Artbeak is next, and this is the one paper that I actually didn't purchase. They sent it to me a while ago, and I was so excited to finally get it into a video and give it a try. First round of testing, I immediately noticed kind of a weird flow. Maybe it's inconsistent sizing, pilling with watercolor pencil, which is concerning because the fact that you cannot get a smooth wash from watercolor pencil on a cold press paper doesn't mean that it should pill. Even washes definitely difficult. The watercolor marker cauliflowered easily. And yes, of course, we have to consider human error. But I am looking to a paper that can make up for some of my human error. 100% cotton watercolor paper worth its salt should be able to do that. Also noticed with all the tests, this one was warping pretty insanely. Now, I'm going to say this, and with the massive caveat that I am not an expert paper maker. I don't know all of the scientificness that goes into making a paper. However, my guess would be this, that the quality of the cotton fibers used in a paper's formulation could affect the surface of the paper, how it accepts sizing, how it then accepts paint. And so when I am saying that there are some potential sizing issues, it could be the actual content of the cotton fibers causing the issues. But honestly, I'm not 100% sure. If you have any insight into this potential questionable sizing versus cotton fibers issue, let me know in comments. And that was my segue to say that there's definitely some weirdness going on when I ran my second page of tests on Artbeak. When dry, there's a lot of textures that I didn't expect to see. I would expect to see water spots. I'd expect to see cauliflowers and blooms because maybe I used a little bit too much water in an area. But I'm seeing some weird kind of scratchy textures. Good news, not noticing pilling. New York Central, and this was probably the most requested paper that I reviewed. At first in my notes, I had written down that this was on the smoother side, but I actually think it's more the fact that the texture of the paper is larger scaled. Paul Reubens and the texture of that paper was slightly scaled down. It does have a slightly thinner feel than I would expect for 140-pound paper. Gorgeous washes. That's all I'm going to say. I made that into 3 words. Gorgeous washes. And yes, the washes did what they were supposed to do. I got this beautiful light to dark ombre without having to work too hard. And no weird cauliflower effects when I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Moves on the paper like you'd expect, wet on wet. Lots of warping with this paper, even with simple, subtle washes, which is definitely a bummer. If I could only find New York Central in a block. Friends, let me know in comments, does it exist? If it does, I don't know, point me in the right direction because this would be huge. When it comes to watercolor pencil, I think I may have found my holy grail of a cold press paper that actually allows me to blend watercolor pencil beautifully. Second round of testing with all the washes, gorgeous, gorgeous. The blue brush stroke just did exactly what I thought it should. Now, when I started to beat this paper up with the scrubbing and the washing and all of the things to see if it was going to pill, I sadly noticed some really obvious little dots of resistance, let's call them. Definitely signaling to me that there are some sizing problems. I'm hoping it was maybe just a bad lot, a bad batch, or something particular about the sheet that I pulled out and used first. But I cannot not mention it because you're going to see it on the screen. Now, when that area was all dry and said and done, there was no weirdness. And also a good thing, no pilling. Now, all of that said, I'm fairly and cautiously excited about this paper, but it did dry quicker than I was hoping, considering my cautious excitement. Not a deal breaker. Okay, probably the second most requested paper that I review, Artist Loft. All right, here we go. It feels a little thinner, but not crazy thin. I have noticed that it stains easily. So I'm not sure why that would be. Might have something again to do with the quality of the cotton. Now, if I have any true blue paper nerds out there, and I say nerds with all of the affection because I married one, but if you know why a paper would stain more than another paper, both claiming to be 100% cotton, when you're using the same medium on both, then head to comments. I like the texture, definitely not as textured as say Paul Reubens or Academy, or of course Arches, which we're not reviewing here. After painting that strawberry on the first page of testing, I felt like maybe there was some sizing weirdness, but it just didn't seem to take the paint like I would expect. Of course, let's always consider user error. I definitely noticed that more as I worked with the watercolor marker and washing it out with clean water. Just some,
textural weirdness.
And why is this important? Let me tell you what. As a professional painter who's been painting like pretty much her whole life, if a paper does some weird stuff when I don't expect it to, it causes me to stumble. It causes me to just kind of freeze and get really nervous and think that I'm doing something wrong. So can you imagine when that happens to a beginner? It could completely throw you off track. And for me, I go back to the joy. Every time I think about a paper and I review a product, I think about, is this going to be a roadblock to joy? This is an important moment here, friends. That is why I review the products that I do. And that is really the number one parameter. Is it going to be a roadblock to your joy? And this could possibly be. Second round of testing with this one, and the washes, a little bit weird, was grabbing the color in ways I wasn't expecting. Okay, then I started to beat up the paper with that pink splotch and all of the scrubbing. Definitely noticing some resisting there at the bottom of the swatch. You can see me literally pointing to it. And it kept happening over and over again. And not until I was really into the wash and the scrub did it start to settle down. So definitely concerning. Now, did I see pilling? No. Now, friends, I gotta let you know, I'm going to be giving you kind of an overview of all the brands and where they stand. And am I gonna pick one favorite? Oh yeah, you bet I am. But am I going to give you some runners up and reasons why they're runners up and specific context in which they might be a number one for you? You bet I am. But you got to stick around. Next up, we have Cody Papers. And this paper is in a class by itself because it is a cotton rag paper, so made very differently than all of the other papers mentioned here. But it has an amazing price for what it does, and I just felt like I needed to include it. Take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt in that this paper is just on its own, and I'll let the cat out of the bag. I highly, highly recommend because it's unlike anything else you've probably tried before. So I am actually trying the 40-pound paper, which is really thin, but shockingly, it held up so well. And the price point on this one is amazing. So don't shy away from the 40-pound. There's also 150-pound. The fibers on this type of paper and the way that it's made, they're longer fibers. So naturally, you're going to kind of get those fibers starting to stand up a little, or it's going to feel potentially like pilling, but it's not really. It's even difficult to rate this paper in terms of the parameters that I've been rating all the other papers because it does so much unique stuff that is very hard to predict. But with this paper and with the proper expectations with a paper like this, that is actually gold. So this paper is majorly joy chasing in terms of just surrendering to its uniqueness, incredible with washes, probably worked the best with mixed media, with the inky marker, with the watercolor pencil. I never felt like the paper was fighting me or giving me textures that I wasn't expecting, except in some of the most glorious ways. Like on that second sheet of tests where I put down that blue stroke, and once it was dry, it revealed all these beautiful little like salt marks almost. If you've ever used salt in wet watercolor, you know the effect. So Cody is my watercolor paper outlier here. Next up is Fluid Friends. Texture on this one, definitely on the smoother side. And it feels a little bit more lightweight than I would expect of a 140-ish pound paper. So I wouldn't say this is a true cold press. It's smooth enough that I feel like it really departs from the cold press category. But they're claiming it is cold press, so you know. It's really hard to get an even wash with this paper. I've actually been painting with this paper for a while, and I'm consistently getting that type of frustrating, inconsistent result. So pilling. This paper does not stand up well to any type of abuse. And honestly, it doesn't even stand up well to kind of a slightly above average use. And so for me, that is a deal breaker. And lastly, and probably most important, even though I said that the pilling was a deal breaker, this paper dries quick. I laid down those linear details on the first sheet of testing and it was already dry. So those details were crisp. They didn't diffuse at all. Compared to a lot of the other papers, almost all of the other papers, when I laid down those linear details in the veins of the leaf,
it was still damp or even really wet at times.
Now, as we near the point in the video where I'm going to give you an overview of my thoughts and kind of round up the review, I do need to say this. There's not a single paper that I've worked with in this video that I feel would be an absolute waste of your money, even given what I just said about the fluid paper. And here's what I mean. Each of these papers has a personality, and you need to match up the paper's personality with the painter's personality. So for example, fluid might be great for someone who does a lot of glazing and who is after more of a realistic effect, not a lot of big washes and so on and so forth. We've got Arteza Expert next, and this is a paper that many of you mentioned having a great experience with. Not a true cold press in terms of texture, but it also had a very strange softness underhand. It handled washes beautifully, especially with that watercolor marker. I couldn't get a good blend on the watercolor pencil, but this paper definitely dried faster than I had hoped, especially considering all of the rave reviews. But I am picky about long dry times. I'm not seeing any dramatic weirdness when it comes to sizing. There was one little spot when I was
beating up the paper on that second sheet of testing.
And while there was the slightest hint of pilling, when I really started leaning into the paper with a lot of pressure, it was nothing that I was worried about. In the beginning, when I felt the softness, I did notice with my more mass tone washes, like that big blue stripe on the second sheet,
that cauliflowering happened easily. And that very likely has something to do with the sizing ingredient or the way that the sizing is applied.
Friends, let me know, do you have a favorite paper so far? Is there one that just stands out that you've used before? Or is there a paper that you've never tried that now that you've seen all of this, you can't wait to give it a go? Let us know in comments. And while you're at it, I would love if you're getting some value out of this video and all of my jabbering on, would you go ahead and give this video a boop?
We're moving on to Meaden.
At first feel, it's a bit thin, but nothing terribly crazy or underwhelming. And the texture is almost near a very classic cold press texture. It handles washes well. If I'm being picky, there's definitely other papers that did a better job, but this one is just fine. It definitely dries a little quicker. I didn't notice any issues with sizing. On that big blue stripe on the second sheet of testing, there are some splotches when dry, but I'm pretty positive that was user error. We're just gonna have to see how this one lines up in terms of price. I do need to mention that on the second sheet of testing, this one proved to be a big buckler. Next up, we have Art and Fly, and I do love saying that one. Pretty classic texture here, slightly thinner than I would expect, but nothing to write home about. I didn't really notice any significant pilling. There were moments where I was like, oh, is something about to happen? But it never really did. And something with pilling too that can happen is it can start to pill, and then if you just add a little bit of water, things start to settle down. Wasn't my favorite in terms of washes. There were other papers that did better. Dried quicker than most, but that also could have been due to some different timing in terms of when I applied the linear details to that leaf. Very consistent sizing here. And remember, the best time to see sizing issues is when you're first laying down color to see if any kind of resisting happens to the pigment starting to soak in, or after everything's completely dry and you're noticing things that just don't make sense. Last but not least is Art Whale. And I decided to include this one. I was watching a video of the Frugal Crafter and she reviewed the Art Whale watercolor tubes and was really surprised at their quality in a good way. And I was like, well, maybe that's gonna transfer right on over to the watercolor paper. Okay, friends, this one definitely has the weirdest texture out of all the papers. It's very columnar. Oh my gosh, has like columns instead of pebbly. Yeah, okay, I'll stop now. So if texture is like a sticking point for you, I would steer clear. But overall, it has an extremely resilient surface. And I wasn't expecting that. Okay, something weird that I noticed that didn't happen with any of the other papers is that it seemed to dull the color when completely dry. Very strange. I don't know why that would be. Perhaps it is something that they're using in the sizing that is having some type of reaction with certain paints. If you have an idea,
head to comments and let us know.
There is some odd stuff happening when things are completely dry. It probably has more to do with the odd texture of the paper than sizing issues necessarily. And you can see on that second sheet of testing when dry, there's definitely very easy blooms happening that could be frustrating for a beginner and clearly even for a professional painter who knows about water control, because I made that happen.
So here's the thing, when you're choosing a paper that you're gonna paint with often and use a lot of, we do need to keep price in mind. We're not watercolor Rockefellers here, right? But we want reliability. We want to be able to somewhat predict the outcome, and we don't want our paper to become a stumbling block. So we're looking at a cost to benefit ratio here. But before I get to my number one choice that really satisfies that cost to benefit ratio, I want to tell you a little bit about some of the papers that didn't make the number one cut but still have great value. New York Central definitely wasn't my favorite when it came to traditional wet on wet watercolor painting, but it is absolutely my new favorite when I'm using watercolor pencils. So take that for what you will, but friends, it lets you get the most juiciness out of your watercolor pencil that you could imagine. The Cody paper, especially the thinner 40-pound version that I tried, is so fantastic for really just getting into your joy and sinking into the unpredictability of watercolor. So it's gonna do things that you cannot control, but if you know that going in, it can create some of the most inspiring and energizing art making sessions imaginable. If you're like me, you love juiciness, you love big washes, you love lots of layers and stuff that are wet and crazy and chaotic, fluid is not the one for you. However, it's a quality paper if you're more of a controlled painter with a traditional approach. The Jen Crafts 100% cotton was a surprise for me because I just assumed it would perform better than its non-100% cotton counterpart, but honestly, that's not the case, at least in my opinion. So for the money, I would definitely go for the non-100% cotton version. I have a whole video where I reviewed a bunch of non-100% cotton watercolor papers, and Jen Crafts was the winner, so you might want to check it out below. Okay, I gotta be honest, the Arteza Expert was disappointing because it was the most expensive, and for the way it performed, there was just a huge disconnect for me. Now, for predictability, performance, quality, all the things compared to the pinnacle, which in my opinion is Arches, I am always going to choose Academy. Academy is from a brand called Baohong, and the Baohong version is their professional. And if I'm wording this incorrectly, you can let me know in comments. But Academy is their student version of the watercolor paper. I've tried both, and I've never understood paying more for Baohong because of the way Academy performs. Now, if you have a different experience with this professional version, let me know in comments. Let's get the conversation started. But for me, Academy all the way. It's always going to be my number one. In fact, Academy and Arches have more similarities in the way they're made than they don't. So when you consider that a sheet of Arches is almost double the cost of Academy, it's a no-brainer. Okay, the one you've all been waiting for. Yes, I love Academy, but today, friends, Meeden watercolor paper, 100% cotton, is the winner. Number one, its price. It's one of the most affordable here. But number two, its performance blew my mind because I could get consistent, satisfying results. But here's the rub, and this is a pretty huge revelation for nearing the end of a video. Reached out to Meeden on Instagram, actually used an AI tool to try to go out and discover information that was available online about this brand. And both times I came up with very little. We never heard back from the brand on Instagram, even though they're fairly active there. Now, in my research, I did discover that Baohong and Meeden are likely sister brands. There's a lot of this that goes on in the art supply world, so it's not terribly surprising. But Baohong makes it really easy to find or get information about their watercolor paper, whereas Meeden ghosted us. So it makes me wonder, are they the same paper, just repackaged? What do you think? All that said, I would not discourage you from using this paper because the proof is in the pudding. The proof is in the testing that I did and the consistencies that I saw. Now, of course, I can't confirm or deny anything regarding its archival nature because that would take months and years potentially. But if you're looking for a really fantastic paper that you can practice on affordably, and if you so happen to create a masterpiece on it, you won't be super sad that you didn't use the best paper, this is the one for you. I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted. I still feel like painting though, so this little project is quick and easy and fulfilling, so give it a go next.